Summer in a club football definitely has its own fascination and magic. This is the time where top sides reinvent themselves and take new shape, even reborn. It's always curious to guess in what form one or other team will emerge from summer break, even if mistakes in estimation are more than possible. Here is a part 1, the talk about 4 clubs that have been arguably the best in Europe last term. The example of the Spanish giant shows us that sometimes it's not necessary to buy a bunch of players in order to be really prominent on the transfer market. This summer, Real made only 2 significant signings and didn't manage to persuade Kylian Mbappé to leave Paris, but you won't characterize this Madrid's campaign as a failure, won't you? There is another paradox. Despite the fact that both Antonio Rüdiger and Aurélien Tchouaméni were among the most sought-after players, the German as a free agent and the Frenchman in the role of prodigy, it seems unlikely that even one of them will be a starter straight away. Knowing how conservative and cautious Carlo Ancelotti is, it would be right to suggest that Real's starting lineup in the upcoming UEFA Super Cup match versus Eintracht will remain intact in comparison with the one we saw in the late May in the decisive Champions League contest against Liverpool, especially if we recall that the German and English clubs are pretty similar in terms of playing style and pace. Meanwhile, the arrival of Rüdiger should give Ancelotti an extra flexibility, especially on the flanks. It sounds odd, I know, given that Antonio is a central defender, but the truth is that his appearance, in a sense, will liberate David Alaba and Nacho in helping Dani Carvajal and Ferland Mendy, the unsung heroes of the Champions League run. Both fullbacks have the same deficiency, the propensity to injuries. Carvajal, who is the best passer in the team along with Luka Modric and Toni Kroos, for many years struggled from persistent muscular problems. That's why he only thrice in his long career at the Santiago Bernabeu reached the 30 matches in Primera season mark. On the other hand, Mendy, who is by far the most reliable defender at Real, had some issues with knees and is also not capable to play really heavy minutes. The presence of Rüdiger means that Alaba, who became famous as left back, now could seamlessly assume Mendy's role in his absence. At the same time, in case if Carvajal is not available for whatever reason, Nacho could deputize him without leaving the center of defense vulnerable. There is also in theory an option with 3 central defenders, but it seems unlikely that Ancelotti will use this formation, keeping in mind that he is unfamiliar with it personally and the current Real footballers aren't mobile and resilient enough to take an advantage from this aggressive alignment. The arrival of Tchouaméni gives Madrid the incentives of the same kind. The young Frenchman, who is reminiscent of Paul Pogba both in terms of constitution and vast array of skills, could take a place of anyone from the famous trio Casemiro, Modric or Kroos, if somebody of the veterans is not eligible. The quality rotation would be an extremely important factor in a strange season with a packed schedule, and we should expect to see Eduardo Camavinga more often on the pitch as well. As for the main tactical scheme, Ancelotti should stay faithful to a classic 4-3-3, although in the big games it will be regularly transformed into inverted 4-4-2 by analogy with last term, with Fede Valverde in the role of effective fourth pure midfielder. This way, the Italian head coach is trying to disguise the lack of mobility and stamina. Given the hardships of the upcoming season, in the form of much more intense competition in La Liga and already mentioned tight fixture, we should expect that Real will deploy a 4-4-2 formation more frequently in order to be more competitive from a physical point of view. For the very same reason, in the upcoming season, we may witness Eden Hazard in a brand new role as Karim Benzema's understudy, bearing in mind that Belgium's lack of mobility and pretty poor work rate, Ancelotti couldn't afford to use him as a winger anymore, barring some minor games against the much weaker opponents. But as a backup centre forward, the role where he could move less and basically don't defend, Hazard, with his dribbling and scoring ability, could be pretty useful, especially if we recall that neither Mariano Diaz nor Borja Mayoral doesn't look as a worthy replacement of Benzema even in not so important matches. In the case of Liverpool, the past 2 months were pretty similar, quiet in terms of number of changes and tumultuous if we are talking about the stature of them. Jurgen Klopp's side was forced to replace Sadio Mane, who was leaving for Bayern, with Darwin Núñez from Benfica. The Uruguayan, incidentally, becomes the second most expensive footballer in the Reds' decorated history. Otherwise, the English giants will start the campaign basically with the same personnel that participated in the last edition of Premier League, although it must be said that the other records, namely Fabio Carvalho and Callum Ramsey, should get some playing time as well. Klopp was also planning to bolster the centre of midfield, but Liverpool haven't been able to outbeat Real in the first battle for Tchouaméni and didn't manage to seduce the young promising Gavi, who opted to sign a new and vastly improved contract with his native Barcelona. As a result, the German, who once again will be splitting minutes like a festive cake between Ibrahima Konate and Joel Matip in the role of Virgil van Dijk's defensive partner, should one more time place high hopes on the shoulders of the mercurial Naby Keita and try to squeeze the last ounces of energy from the evergreen James Milner. Actually, this is Klopp's perennial problem. His version of up-tempo football is so sophisticated and physically demanding that only 15-16 players within the team are really suitable for this sort of task. Here lies a huge challenge. Last term, the grey-bearded German has been able to find more quality than usual in this narrow group of footballers, which enabled his side to fight for unprecedented quadruple. It would be extremely hard to replicate this brilliant run, keeping in mind that the Liverpool manager has to rely on the same core of players, and this time the schedule would be even tighter. If in these conditions Klopp will spend another stellar campaign, it would be a masterpiece of coaching. As for Liverpool's arch-rival, this summer was and continued to be a time of searching for new motivation and fresh blood, well-needed assets for the insatiable Josep Guardiola, whose commitment to excellence is so encompassing that very few players could stay around the Spaniard for more than 3-4 years. Gabriel Jesus, Raheem Sterling, Alexander Zinchenko and Fernandinho decided to try their luck at the other clubs, making way for a batch of ambitious newcomers, headed by Erling Haaland. There is little doubt that with the arrival of the Norwegian, the amount of fast break goals at the City of Manchester Stadium will drastically go up. It's curious that at the moment Guardiola is more than ever looking for the fast and lively legs, perhaps even more than for intelligence and technique. For instance, the champions of England are trying to acquire Marc Cucurella from Brighton, one of the most resilient and hard-working players in the world. Villarreal's Pau Torres, who is accustomed to a fast football, is also a matter of interest for the citizens. It's almost certain that in August the club will buy a left back or central defender, maybe even both of them, because currently the squad is really short in this regard, and Guardiola is too smart to not realize it. Keeping in mind the departure of Zinchenko, the fact that the dissolute Benjamin Mendy turned from footballer into a criminal figure long time ago, and the age of Kyle Walker, who is struggling with injuries, the Spaniard, as for now, will be forced to use one of the central defenders on the flank, predominantly John Stones, which could lead to the additional issues. As for the search of extra energy, the reasons behind it are pretty apparent. Winning 4 Premier League titles out of 5 took an enormous amount of efforts, and Guardiola must revitalize his squad now in order to continue to dominate. It would be right to say that at the moment he needs more new faces than new ideas. Actually, he has never been short of the latter. It's always an enviable and ungrateful job try to predict City's starting lineup beforehand prior to the season, but for the time being, this assignment is probably doubly difficult. If we recall that the future of Bernardo Silva is surrounded by the clouds of uncertainty, the Portuguese midfielder wants to play for a Spanish top club. Barca are rumored to be his next destination, but whether the Catalans will be able to find miraculously another ton of cash out of nowhere remains to be seen. In any case, Guardiola will continue to actively and methodically rotate midfielders in an attempt of taking the very best of them in each game, both physically and technically. Perhaps only Kevin De Bruyne and Bernardo Silva, in case if he won't leave, will be playing really regularly at that rate. Hence, these versions of the starting lineup are pretty much rough. Among this quartet of clubs, Bayern stands alone, courtesy to the fact that the German giants were the only team that visibly changed the playing philosophy recently. The transition from the predominantly combinational football to the fast fun, which started with the arrival of Julian Nagelsmann, hasn't been plain sailing, but it looks like now the young manager got most of the tools for the style he prefers, barring Robert Lewandowski's painful departure. Indeed, the talks about formation often prove to be contrived, but in the case of today's Bayern, the selection of concrete tactical scheme could be absolutely vital on the road to possible success, or on the road to potential failure, if we reverse the meaning. Looking from the outside, it seems that Nagelsmann should opt for a 3-2-4-1 alignment, bearing in mind that the trio of central defenders is absolutely transparent after the arrival of Matthijs de Ligt. Benjamin Pavard and Lucas Hernandez will flank the Dutchman in this scenario. The problem is the scheme will leave a lot of good players untapped. For instance, Noussair Mazraoui and in particular Alphonso Davies will be basically out of action under these circumstances. On top of that, this formation puts an extra pressure on the center of midfield, and the unchallenged Bundesliga champions are really linked there at the moment, after Leon Goretzka's nasty injury. So we should expect that Nagelsmann, who is not only extremely energetic but also a creative head coach, will alternate both formations, depending on the opponent, his team's physical shape, stage of the season, and some other factors. As for the ways to replace Lewandowski, it would be rather collective than individual task. Thomas Müller and Sadio Mane should jointly take over the pole's duties, but it would be logical to assume that the Senegalese will be playing in the role of number 9 or a false 9 more regularly, given that the German, with his high football IQ and ability to find open partners in general, is more effective on the edge of the box than directly in it. Moreover, Mane last term played exactly in this role at Liverpool, another fast football orientated team whose valuables are pretty similar.